Welcome back, everybody, to the Truth Channel. We are continuing reading The Crucifixion and Death of Jesus Christ by Kelli, Ritter. It is a good book to get the medical aspects of crucifixion, what it was really like, the pain Jesus endured, and the suffering he endured for us. So let's continue reading that. We are on the chapter, What Was Flogging Like? So let's continue reading that. Flogging was a legal prerogative to every Roman execution. Execution, and only women and Roman senators or soldiers, except in cases of desertion, were exempt. The usual instrument was a short whip, flagellum, with several braided leather thongs of variable lengths, with small iron balls or sharp pieces of sheep bones were tied at intervals. Occasionally, staves were used for scourging. The man was stripped of his clothing, and his hands were tied to the upright post. The back, buttocks, and legs were flogged either by two soldiers, lictors, or by one of the alternated positions. The severity of the scourging depended on the disposition of the lictors and was intended to weaken the victim to a state of just short of a collapse or death. After the scourging, the soldiers taunted the victim. Flogging or scourging was done before every crucifixion. The scourging was intended to bring the victim to a state just short of death. Also, it hurt a lot. The whip had iron balls tied to a few inches from each leather thong on the whip. Sometimes sharp sheep bones would be tied on the ends. The iron balls would cause deep bruising, while the leather thongs would cut into the skin. The sheep bones would hasten the process of cutting into the skin. After a few lashes, the skin would be cut through and pulled off by the Roman flagrum. The muscles would begin to be cut. Blood loss was considerable, and the pain would probably have put the victim in a state of shock. A typical flogging in parasitic law was limited to 39 lashes, but Jesus did not receive a parasitic law lashing. He received a Roman lashing, which had no laws on how many times a person could receive lashings. Jesus got the worst of any crucified man in ancient times, no doubt. Medical aspects of scourging. As the Roman soldiers repeatedly struck the victim's back with full force, the iron balls would cause deep contusions, and the leather thongs and sheep bones would cut into the skin and subcutaneous tissues. Then, as the flogging continued, the lacerations would tear into the underlying skeletal muscles and produce quivering ribbons of bleeding flesh. Pain and blood loss generally set the stage for circulatory shock. The extent of blood loss may well have determined how long the victim would survive on the cross. Variations in crosses used for crucifixion and struck him on the head with a wooden staff. Moreover, when the soldiers tore the robe from Jesus' back, they probably reopened the scourging wounds. The severe scourging, with its intense pain and appreciable blood loss, most probably left Jesus in a pre-shock state. Moreover, hematidrosis had rendered his skin particularly tender. The physical and mental abuse meted out by the Jews and the Romans, as well as the lack of food, water, and sleep, also contributed to his generally weakened state. Therefore, even before the actual crucifixion, Jesus' physical condition was at least serious and possibly critical. Skin would literally be ripped off the victim's body, mainly in the back, but elsewhere as well. The movie The Passion of the Christ is about as accurate as you can get when picturing the scourging of Jesus. Crucifixion practices. Crucifixion probably first began among the Persians. Alexander the Great introduced the practice to Egypt and Carthage, and the Romans appeared to have learned it from the Carthaginians. Although the Romans did not invent the crucifixions, they perfected it as a form of torture and capital punishment that was designed to produce a slow death with the maximum pain and suffering. It was one of the most disgraceful and cruel methods of execution and was usually reserved for only slaves, foreigners, revolutionaries, and the vilest of criminals. Roman law usually protected Roman citizens from crucifixion, exceptions perhaps in the ease of desertion by soldiers. In the earliest form in Persia, the victim was either tied to a tree and was tied to or impaled upon an upright post, usually to keep the guilty victim's feet from touching the holy ground. Only later was a true cross used. It was characterized by an upright post, stipes, and a horizontal crossbar called the patibulum. And it had several variations, although archaeologically, and historical evidence strongly indicates that the tau cross was preferred by the Romans in Palestine at the time of Christ's crucifixion. Practices often varied in a given geographic region in accordance with the imagination of the executioners, and the Latin cross and other forms also may have been used. It was customary for the condemned man to carry his own cross. In the discussed 4 gospel accounts, it is implied in one of the epistles of 1 Peter 2:24, a detailed word study of the ancient Greek text for this verse indicates that the scourging of Jesus was particularly harsh. Verse 33. It is not known whether the number of lashes was limited to 39, which, with accordance to Jewish law, the Roman soldiers amused that this weakened the man had claimed to be king, and began to mock him by placing a robe on his shoulders and a crown of thorns on his head and a wooden staff as a scepter in his right hand. Next, they spat on Jesus, nailing his wrists, left size of an iron nail, center location of the nail and wrist between the carpals and radius, right cross section of wrist at level of plane indicated at left, showing path of nail with transection of median nerve, and the impalement of flexor pollex longus, but without injury to a major artery, trunks without fracture of bones. From the flogging, opposed to the site of crucifixion outside the city walls, he was usually naked, unless this was prohibited by local customs. Since the weight of the entire cross was probably well over 300 pounds, only the crossbar was carried, the patibulum weighing 75 to 125 pounds. Was placed across the nape of the victim's neck and balanced along both shoulders. Usually the outstretched arms were tied to the crossbar. The processional to the site of crucifixion was led by a Roman military guard, headed by a centurion. One of the soldiers carried a sign on which the condemned man's name and crime were displayed. Later, the titulus would be attached to the top of the cross. The Roman guard would not leave the victim until they were sure of his death. Outside the city walls, was permanently located the heavy upright wooden stipes on which the patibulum would be secured. In the case of the tau cross, this was accomplished by means of a mortise and tenon joint, with or without reinforcement by ropes. To prolong the crucifixion process, a horizontal wooden block or plank serving as a crude seat, sedile or sedulum, was often attached midway down the stipes, only very rarely, and probably later, than the time of Christ, it was an additional block, separatium, employed for the transfixion of the feet. At the site of execution, by law, the victim was given a bitter drink mixed with wine and myrrh, gall, as a mild anesthetic. The criminal was then thrown to the ground on his back with his arms outstretched along the patibulum. The hands could be nailed to or tied to the crossbar, but nailing was apparently preferred by the Romans. The archaeological remains of a crucified body found in an ossuary near Jerusalem and dated from the time of Christ indicated that the nails were tapered iron spikes approximately 5 to 7 inches long, 13 to 18 centimeters, along with a square shaft 3 to 5 inches or 1 centimeter across. Furthermore, ossuary findings and the Shroud of Turin have documented that the nails commonly were driven through the wrists rather than the palms, as the palms would not support the weight of the body. After both arms were fixed to the crossbar, the patibulum and the victim together were lifted onto the stipes. On the low cross, 4 soldiers could accomplish this relatively easy. However, on the tall cross, the soldiers used either wooden forks or ladders.